The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
I'm Ray Lemura, and welcome to this edition of Cable Reports. Our guest today is United States Senator Mark Warner. Welcome, Senator.
Ray, thanks for having me.
We're really glad you could be here with us today.
Glad to be back in Richmond.
Great, great. Senator, our economy is starting to grow and roar again, but for many Virginians it's growing a little too slowly, and especially in certain segments of the Commonwealth. Can you talk a little about things that can be done or what we can all do together?
Well, Ray, I think if you look over the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen a dramatic increase in the stock market. We've seen millions of net new private sector jobs, and I think those are good signs. But if you're in Southside Virginia or parts of Southwest Virginia and you're still unemployed, the stock market being a record high doesn't mean much. I still believe the single biggest thing we could do for job creation is for those of us in Washington to take off our Democrat and Republican hats and actually put a major fiscal plan in place for our country. I think the single biggest drag on economic recovery is the threat of further government shutdowns and government budget battles. I've been a big advocate since the 5 years I've been in the Senate of a bipartisan approach that would say, all right, Democrats, you've got to be willing to make some movement on entitlement reform. Republicans, you need to make some movement on tax reform. And we need to start attacking that $17 trillion debt that we're going to leave our kids if we don't attack. If we can put a plan in place. I had a plan that was based upon the Simpson-Bowles plan earlier. It was the so-called Gang of Six. It didn't get enacted, but if we can get a plan like that in place, that will do more in terms of confidence building and I believe unleash more private capital, because corporate balance sheets look really good at this point. We've just got to encourage businesses to get off the sidelines, invest back in America, and there's a lot of good things about America at this point. Our energy costs have come down. We're much more competitive on a manufacturing side. We do have a little bit of a 2-year break here where we've managed to, since the government shut down, to have a truce a bit in Washington, so that's given us a little bit of a reprieve, but a big budget deal, the so-called grand bargain, is still the single biggest thing I think we could do for job creation. And I think that would do more than any single other governmental action.
Right. Well, I know here, when you were here in Richmond, you worked in a very bipartisan way, bringing Democrats and Republicans to fix the budget crisis that we had here in Virginia. Gridlock seems to be the prevailing mood in Washington. How do you work past that? How do you get through that?
I tell you, it's probably been my biggest frustration since I've been in Washington. We've got challenges in Virginia, but I think there still is something about a Virginia way that says, you know, we may argue a bit, but at the end of the day, let's get something done. Unfortunately, in Washington, so much of the power structure on both political parties pushes the men and women who go there, I think many of them with good intentions, into the far left or the far right. So what I've tried to do is create, in effect, a safe space for people to work together. Every major piece of legislation I work on, I've got a Republican partner, because quite honestly, I don't think the American public trusts either political party enough to give them a blank check. So if you've got a bipartisan piece of legislation, I think it sends a signal that it's more in the country's interest than a particular partisan interest. My hope is that after this election, we'll be able to see more bipartisanship. I think there's a great deal of frustration in both political parties about particularly the embarrassment of the government shutdown last year, and there's a recognition that we're going to have to find ways to work more together. Right now, even as we talk, there are 2 major pieces of legislation that I've been working on that are strongly bipartisan. A major housing finance reform, where I've got 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, that would change our housing finance system, put more private capital in front of any kind of taxpayer risk around the so-called Fannie and Freddie institutions, wind them down, create a new system. I've got another bipartisan piece of legislation about creating an infrastructure financing authority. The United States of America is the only country in the world that doesn't allow private capital to invest it in an organized way in our roads and bridges and airports and ports. We actually even have an office in the Department of Treasury that encourages American pension funds to invest in Europe rather than investing in America, because we don't have that kind of structure. Would be a 5 Democrat, 5 Republican, again, infrastructure financing authority. So there are bipartisan activities going on in Washington. Occasionally the news doesn't like to report them, because when we actually work together, that doesn't make as good a headlines as people feuding and fighting. But I think I'm optimistic that particularly after the election, things will get better.
Great, great. And speaking about that bipartisan effort, you have just got through the Senate the DATA Act, and that was in a bipartisan manner as well. What's the DATA Act do, and why is it important?
You know, Ray, it's one of those bills that probably folks won't hear a lot about. I've partnered with Rob Portman, the Republican senator from Ohio, former head of the Office of Management and Budget.
Right.
And what it starts with a simple premise. I was a business guy longer than I've been in politics, and I'm big on financial accountability and trying to follow the money. I was very proud of the fact that Virginia was named the best managed state in the country when I was governor. Trying to bring those same management techniques to Washington has been a little bit harder. So the DATA Act is pretty simple. It says you ought to be able, as a taxpayer, you and I ought to be able to follow the money and make federal spending much more transparent than it is. Right now, for example, in the Department of Defense, there are 200 separate financial accounting systems. That's crazy.
Right.
So what the DATA Act says is, it says we've got to start having clearer financial systems, similar financial terms, so an expenditure or a grant is termed the same way, allow you, in effect, follow the money, follow your tax dollar all the way through the process down to the actual individual grantee, so we can have better accountability. If you're a grantee, if you're University of Virginia and you're getting a grant from a federal agency, you should only have to report it once. Right now we've got people reporting it 4 and 5 and 6 times. And all this information should be presented to the consumer on a user-friendly site. If you can Google all kinds of information, you should be able to Google where your tax dollars go. And so this DATA Act, it's been called the most important act around government transparency since the Freedom of Information Act of about 30 years ago. So I think it'll be a very useful tool for policy wonks like me, particularly if we're going to do the grand bargain. If we're going to have to find a way to cut back on government spending in a smarter way than the kind of blunt acts of the so-called sequestration cuts that were just, set up to be stupid and were stupid.
Right.
You've got to look at actually what's performing and what's not performing. And I think the DATA Act will give us that tool. And I was very proud that Rob Portman and I got it through the Senate.
Right. Well, I have to say, as a Virginian, admiring the Virginia way, you exemplify that, and not only here, but doing it in Washington and bringing together that bipartisan approach, I think is important to all of Virginians, and because you get things done.
Right. That's, the thing people ask me, as somebody who was in business longer than I'm in politics, people ask me the difference between business and politics. And I think about it sometimes. I think, politics is the only business where somebody can spend the whole career doing nothing but saying what's wrong with the other guy and just being a critic and never putting out a solution, and that being a successful outcome.
Right.
If in business all I did was run down your product and I didn't have a good product myself, I'd be out of business. So
right.
I hope I don't ever lose the mindset of a business, let's get things done in my public service.
All right, great. This is a question that my wife is very interested in. That's
All right.
the cost of higher education here in Virginia. We've got a son at UVA now and a daughter getting ready to go off to college. Costs are continuing to escalate. What can be done in this area?
Right. I tell you, I hear more about student debt and higher education costs out and around the state, even sometimes than health care. So I think there's 3 or 4 things we can do. One, we have to recognize that we've kind of had a bad deal, I think, going on for some time. Federal and state direct support for higher education has been going down.
Right.
Costs have been going up. The way that we've kind of made up the gap is we've encouraged students to go deeply, deeply into debt. I was the first person in my family to ever graduate from college, and I failed a couple times at business before I was successful. But when I came out of college and law school, I only had $15,000 worth of debt. If I'd come out with $80,000 or $100,000, the way some of these kids are now, I'm not sure I would have had the courage to try a couple times to be an entrepreneur.
Right.
So I don't think there's a single silver bullet. Let me give you 3 or 4 suggestions on things I think that are targeted and smart that we could do about higher education. One, and this is, again, a piece of legislation I've got with Marco Rubio, the Republican senator from Florida. I think before any parent or child goes to college, they ought to be able to go on a website, and our bill is called Know Before You Go, and you ought to be able to look by college, how much it's going to cost. If you major in accounting or major in sociology, what's your chance of getting a job?
Right.
What kind of jobs are they going to pay? How much average debt you're going to go into, so that you know as much about your college choice as you do about buying a car or buying a house, since your college education costs as much as at least a house, if not more.
Right.
And oftentimes, parents and students don't have that information. And we ought to have it for colleges, community colleges. We ought to have it for career and technical education. I was over at Piedmont Valley Community College the other day, and they were training sonar technicians in terms of medical technology.
Right.
They got a 100% placement rate. So, first of all, we've got to equip people with knowledge. And know before you go. The data's already collected. Let's make it user-friendly, number one. Number two, I think for students, particularly first-generation students going to college, if we could have them knock off a semester or a year of college in high school with dual enrollment in the community college, that lowers their costs, and it also means that students will actually be more likely to finish school. So this is particularly for low-income students. They get a Pell Grant in college. Well, if you can get a Pell Grant in college, but if you can, why not allow that Pell Grant to be used in high school if you're taking college courses at the community college? That's the second idea. Third idea, there already exists in our college repayment programs the ability for a young person, and particularly I think about people who might want to start a business or buy a house, because a lot of times people aren't buying houses now coming out of school because they got so much debt, to say, we should schedule your repayment plans from your student debt based upon your income level. This is already part of the law, but we don't really describe it very well to students. So income-based repayment might mean that it takes a little longer to pay off that debt, but I think it's something that could actually provide some relief for students coming in. And then finally, and this is the part where we're going to have to look at it, a bigger policy area. Right now, student debt is about $1.2 trillion. There's more student debt than there is credit card debt.
All right. And
this could be the next financial crisis. I think about the fact that a person can go out and refinance a house right now for around 4.5%. Yet there are people out there with college loans at 10, 11, 12%. We're looking at some areas. Is there a way that we could help students consolidate their debt and refinance it? Mm-hmm. Now, it has to be in a way that's financially responsible. But if we could bring down those debt burdens of these kind of 20s and 30-year-olds who are entering into the economy right now, one, that'll mean they can buy more houses, they can buy more autos, they can actually invest in and start more businesses. That in itself would help the economy going as well. So I think this issue of student debt is one that is going to grow in importance. And finally, what we're going to also have to do, and I think we still get great value on our Virginia universities, we're going to have to continue to work with colleges about how they can end up starting to bring down their costs. Not every college can be all things to all people.
Right.
And a little more discipline in higher education is something that's long overdue.
All right. I think that's great. All those ideas sound really exciting.
Thanks.
You have been a leader on cybersecurity matters, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that you're working on there.
Well, thanks, Ray. I'm on the Intelligence Committee as well as on the Banking Committee. And obviously as a background as a business guy, I had to tell you, I was even surprised when I learned how many times a day every bank, every retail institution is attacked by cyber criminals. And I think most Americans got a sense of this last Christmas when we heard about the data breach at the Target stores and Neiman Marcus and other stores. About 70 million Americans had their identity or their credit cards violated. I know I had to get rid of one of my credit cards because it had been breached by these cyber criminals. And again, there's no single answer, but there are some things we can do. One, and we recently in Richmond, working with the retailers, we said the retailers came together in a collaborative effort, no legislation needed, but said, let's go ahead and share best practices and share information. If one retail store gets breached, they can share it with another retail store so that you can say, hey, watch out, this is the way they're breaking into our system.
Right.
So information sharing is number one. Number two, this will require legislation. I don't think most Virginians realize if you've got a credit card and a debit card, and debit cards are the fastest growing area around cards, and a lot of times our kids have debit cards. I know that's what my kids have got. Debit cards don't have the same protections as a credit card. Credit card, you get somebody breaking in using your credit card, you're limited to $50 worth of exposure. Debit cards are $500 worth of exposure. So we've got legislation, bipartisan again, that would say credit and debit cards, the consumer protections ought to be equalized. That's the second thing. Third item we're looking at, and this is going to take some work. What should be the standard when a Target or a Walmart or one of these stores are violated, that the store or the bank has to report? You know, you've got to get this right, got to work with law enforcement, but I think consumers need to have this information at a pretty early basis so they can make decisions not to, to become more secure with their own cards. And part of that will require also consumers guarding their PIN numbers in a more secure way. So this notification issue is important. Two last things. And I'm sorry, again, so many items. There's not a single solution. You know, in Europe right now, your credit cards are much more carefully protected than they are in America. There's much less cyber crime in terms of credit card theft. The reason is they've got a technology called chip and PIN that's built into the card. So you not only have your PIN number, but you've got an encoder in the credit card. We don't have that in America. So I've been encouraging the banks and the retailers to work together to move to this chip and PIN, and then there's even a greater security called tokenization after that. This is going to be an evolving, ongoing process. We're not going to be able to declare victory because cyber criminals, these hackers are very, very smart, but we're going to have to constantly stay alert on this and be guarded. And final point, and this is kind of with the news that's going on right now, the Target breach that hit so many of us, most of those cyber criminals all came from Ukraine. And Ukraine's been in the news right now. Europe and the United States is trying to help the new pro-Western Ukrainian government. I think that's appropriate. But if we're going to help the new pro-Western Ukrainian government, one of the things we ought to demand of that government is, hey, you guys got to crack down on these cyber criminals. You cannot continue to allow Ukraine to be a haven for cyber criminals. The previous government there turned a blind eye to that, and they were attacking not only America but also Europe. And this ought to be a little bit if we're going to help you, you need to help us. And so far we've been talking with the Justice Department, and they are very interested in pursuing that. So this is going to be an ongoing struggle. There will be legislative items, there will be business items we can do, but they're also going to have to be, we as individuals are going to have to be a little more careful with our personal credit information.
You were talking about Virginia retailers coming together. Is there a national solution? Because some of these retailers are out of the state, and are the conversations going on there?
Well, the national retailers are working with the Virginia retailers where they're all sharing this information. The banking industry already had information sharing. The retailers now, just in the last week, have set up this on a national basis. And what I've been trying to encourage is, certain areas we need legislation, certain areas we just need common sense. And so what I've been, in the past, what's happened, sometimes the banks and the retailers have got into battles about blaming each other about whose fault it was. The bank's not secure, the retailer's not secure. I've said, listen, if Congress sticks our nose in this, sometimes we can mess things up. You guys ought to try to just cooperate together, and we've actually seen some real movement.
Those are great things to hear. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is when you were governor, your passion for broadband expansion. And maybe you can talk a little bit about why it's such a passionate issue for you. The telecommunications industry, it is of great importance to this industry as well.
Well, I know important to cable operators, but it's important because I remember one of the things I was proudest of as governor was when we were able to use some of our tobacco funds, some state funds, private funds, and we put in what was called the Mid-Atlantic Rural Broadband Deployment all across Southside Virginia. And a whole lot of communities got connected in ways that other parts of America weren't. And why it's so important is broadband deployment isn't going to guarantee that a business is going to move to your community. But I can sure as heck guarantee you, if you don't have broadband, you're not even going to get looked at. And that's important for education. It's important for programming in terms of quality of life. But it's also important, every business has to be connected today. You may not call yourself a tech business. You may be an auto shop. You may be in manufacturing. But the way you pass your information is still through broadband. So I think we need to do more. There's still about 18% of America, rural America, that doesn't have good coverage. I got some legislation through the agriculture bill, actually, that reformed the ag broadband program to start making sure that those funds were distributed more to underserved areas. I think in many communities in Virginia, you're going to be only able to take the cable fiber to a certain extent, and you're going to need the last mile probably to go over wireless communications. So we need to do a better job of licensing that wireless communications. We need to do a better job, quite honestly, of some of these small towns coming together with the school division and the town and maybe a few businesses to generate enough demand so that somebody will come in and put in that system. This is, again, an area where I'm not sure we need as much legislation as we need just more cooperation. And I hear, particularly across still parts of Southside and the Valley, folks that are very concerned that they don't have access to broadband, and they sometimes think their kids aren't getting the same quality education, or they're thinking they might have to move because they might want to work at home, but they can't do it without broadband. So making sure that every home in America has high-speed broadband, I think that ought to be a policy goal that we continue to advance.
I know just from where we sit, often people who have access to broadband still don't even take the service.
Right.
And I know a number of our companies, Comcast and Cox Communications, have started initiatives to encourage more broadband adoption, especially kids who are on the free school lunch programs. And maybe you could talk a little bit about education, the importance of education and the access to broadband.
If I think about what are the workers of the 21st century going to look like? Not all of them are going to have to be engineers or even have to have college degrees. But they are going to have to understand how to use technology and ability to use your smartphones and your iPads and these other devices. And I look at kids who are preschool age, using these tools, interacting in an individual way. The remarkable part about broadband and, for example, distance learning is it really can individualize education. And if we want every kid in Virginia to start with a fair shot, I mean, government can't guarantee a success, but we ought to make sure everybody gets a fair shot. I think broadband, and particularly for preschool educational techniques, is one of the most important things we can do to level the playing field.
Right.
Not every child is going to have the same kind of supportive home life, and I'm not saying broadband is an answer in and of itself,
right,
but a parent that has access to broadband, that has access to knowing what educational tools are out there, that child's going to be better prepared to learn when they go to school. So I am a huge, huge believer. That was, as you know, that was my industry was in telecommunications before I got into government, and I think it has an enormous ability in the information age to empower people, but it also has the ability to leave people behind.
Right.
And in Virginia, I want to make sure nobody gets left behind.
Right. Senator, we've had a lot of veterans here in the Commonwealth from the Iraq and Afghanistan war. There have been backlogs of processing claims at the VA. I understand that you are working for some reforms there, working with the College of William and Mary. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, our country owes many sacred obligations, but we owe no greater obligation than the commitment we've made to our veterans. And in Virginia, we have almost 800,000 veterans or their families. We have highest concentration per capita of any state. And I see these men and women coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, many of them not just with physical wounds, with but with mental challenges, PTSD, and others. So there's two areas we need. One, we need to continue to encourage industry, and we've started a number of initiatives to help veterans get jobs. And we're working with the energy sector, we're working with the Northern Virginia Tech Council and others, because you know, a company that wants to hire a veteran, it has to go the extra mile, because simply saying we're open for business isn't good enough. Many of these vets are going to come in with issues, and you need to have somebody that can help counseling or other resources for your veterans to help make that transition, point one. The second part, and this is the part that's gotten me so darn angry, is veterans earn and deserve benefits. Yet, the Veterans Administration at one point was 600,000 claims behind. And people were waiting sometimes more than a year to get to the claims process. That's just unacceptable.
Right.
I brought in the VA head, former General Shinseki, and gave him more than a piece of my mind. And he explained that they are transferring to a paperless system and speeding up the process. They have made some progress. He's coming back in to see me shortly. And they've taken that 600,000 number down to the mid-200,000s. We're not done yet, but it's making progress.
Right.
But one of my frustrations has been, because some of these claims are fairly complicated, we recruited the William & Mary Law School to create a veterans law clinic where law students, for free, no cost to the taxpayer, help the veteran process their claims. Now, this is a win for the taxpayer, it's a win for the veterans, it's a win for the law students. It took us 2 years to get the VA to accept William & Mary as a, in effect, sanctioned party. They finally agreed. I'm happy to report that about a month ago, there was a major conference held in Washington where we started to recruit law firms and law schools across the country. Our goal is to have more than 50 law schools and more than 50 law firms create programs similar to what William & Mary put in place to help these veterans get these claims processed quicker. Not a full silver bullet, but a way that we can show in some small way our thanks to these men and women who protect our country.
Great. Senator, we have just about a minute left. I know you have an outstanding working relationship with Senator Kaine. Maybe you can talk just briefly about that.
Well, you know, it's great. Tim Kaine and I have known each other for 33 years. We're both good friends. You know, he's got committees assignments that are more kind of armed services and foreign relations, kind of more taking that portfolio. My business background puts me more on finance and banking and budget. We're both on budget. I'm also on the Intel committee. And we try to just, you know, I think we can, because we cooperate and we're friends, we can double our value for Virginia. End of the day, this is about remembering the 8 million people who we serve, and in a place like Washington that sometimes is kind of confounding, trying to wake up every day and say, how do we move the ball? How do we actually get stuff done? How do we spend less time blaming somebody else, but actually finding a bipartisan solution? And from debt to all these issues, that's what I hope to stay at.
Well, Senator, I really appreciate the time you shared with us today. I learned a lot, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing for us.
Thank you, Ray.
All right. And thank you for watching this edition of Cable Reports.